Welcome to the Innovation Conversation, a podcast about innovators, both in business and real life. Hosted by myself, Ricardo Pascual, and Harry McDonough. This podcast is also sponsored by ODEV Tech. ODEV Tech is your premier software development partner. Make sure you check them out at odev.tech. The podcast is also sponsored by Notion.so. Notion is offering 6 months for free for new users. Make sure you check out our website, thestartupevents.co.uk, to redeem this offer.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Innovation Conversation. Today we are joined by Lorraine Carter. Lorraine, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. I'm delighted to be here.
It's a pleasure having you here. Lorraine, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Well, my whole background, my career has been around building brands to drive growth. And that's from working with small, early-stage businesses through to large enterprise organizations. The fundamental principles are the same. It's just the nuances and depth which you go into. But I have a really strong purpose-driven philosophy about making brand strategy accessible to more leanly resourced businesses so they can still build robust, successful brands even without big marketing teams.
So you kind of help them, I guess, create their own story and put it out there for people to be attracted to it.
Yeah, it's about building out a really robust brand strategy. There's key elements you include in doing that, mapping that out effectively so you've got a really strong North Star to reference off, and then looking at how you deploy that really effectively over the relevant channels. And of course, with early stage businesses, you're typically iterating, you're moving fast, you're developing, so you've got to have some flexibility around that. But you've also got to have a strong baseline that anchors you back to what it is you're building and who your target audience is and what your revenue model is. So there are the fundamentals, and then it's right, well, how do we, in order to be a powerful brand, you've got to have some strong differentiating factors. So having real clarity or getting clarity around, well, what is our value proposition? What are our core differentiators? And not losing sight of the fact, particularly with, say, tech businesses, they tend to be very feature benefits driven a lot of the time, but you cannot lose sight of the fact that 60% of branding is driven by emotion and 40% by product or service. So you've got to understand what are the underlying drivers about what it is or the reason why a customer might or a prospect might buy what you have to offer. And what is the big difference it's going to make in their life, whether you're selling B2C or B2B. And then you build on that, but you've got to have so it's not about you. The first thing your customer is going to look at is what's in it for me and what's a compelling reason to buy and do I get it really quickly? And how am I so much better than anything else that might be competing in that space in the marketplace?
And how do you get started with all this?
How did I get started? Oh, gosh. I guess I started off my career working in agencies. Then I worked for a while in television. And then I worked a lot with consumer-oriented brands before moving much more into the B2B context. And if you're working with consumer brands and you're working in a retail environment, it's a very cutthroat environment. You have very short life. If you can't sell very fast and capture the attention of the consumer within 9 seconds and convince them of what it is that's really compelling and why you're the best option and you fit within what they're prepared to spend, you're going to be delisted within 2 to 3 weeks. So, and also bringing any physical product to market typically has a capital outlay. It's very different for building maybe a tech brand and the distribution behind all of that. And then the whole story around the proposition of what it is, what you're going to sell. So that's what got me into the whole area of building brands to drive growth. And then diversifying, working across, I pretty much have worked across all sectors at this stage, except for the few that I've electively decided not to for whatever ethical reasons, but pretty much all sectors at this stage. So the principles are the same, but the nuances of what drives the decision-making and also cultural, the filters of when we're living in a global world. So a lot of the communications I would be involved in is very multicultural. So understanding the drivers, whether you're a product offering, and I use that in the broad sense of whether it's a SaaS or a tech product versus a physical product, because you're still productizing your offering, but the drivers behind buying the subtleties of that will vary depending on also the cultural reference point, because that becomes the immediate filter through which people see things and how they make buying decisions. So all of that impacts in terms of how you sell what it is you have to offer.
When you're building a startup, I'm sure you meet a lot of early stage founders.
Yeah.
What advice would you give them in terms of the branding and how to position themselves in the market?
The first thing I'd start with is, and this might sound like a corny or coined phrase, but step into the customer's shoes. What are the psychological drivers behind why they are potentially going to buy what you have to offer? And the first thing, human nature, when that person even notices what you have to offer, first of all, you've even got to get their attention in a very noisy world. So you've got to break through that noise. And the first thing, subconsciously, they're going to ask themselves in a nanosecond is, what's in it for me? And you've got to have that front and center really strong and compelling. The level at which you drive that depends, again, what kind of brand you're building. So understanding the psychological drivers and the challenges around, are you solving a massive problem? Are you disrupting something in the brand? Are you selling something that is instant gratification from a customer point of view? All of those have different drivers. So really being clear about that. The next thing is your gap analysis. So that, everybody who's building a business understands looking for gaps and opportunities in the market. And so coming back to those fundamental principles, remember, a brand is 60% about emotions and 40% about the physical product or service, physical or non-physical. So what are the emotional drivers around perception? Because perception is everything. Consistency and perception is everything. So you can actually potentially build a very robust, a very strong brand, but it may not actually be the best, say, piece of tech in the marketplace, because you have convinced the marketplace with the emotional drivers and understanding what it is and how people make choices. So that then comes back to, right, you've done your background, your baseline, you've done your analysis, you can see where there are gaps and opportunities, then mapping out your different target audience, those purchase personas. Every business has its core target audience, and then it has its secondary or third. Is it the core target audience that's the most profitable? They have your whole business built around core target audience as it's perceived, but actually your greatest level of revenue is coming from your secondary audience. So examples of that per se would be two very different examples I'll give you here for context. So if you take, say, Harley Davidson, and I'm picking brands here that everybody knows. So if you take Harley Davidson, and you have that classic cliche of what the Harley Davidson biker looks like, the leathers, perhaps a little bit scruffy, out on the wide open road. But actually, the greatest area of revenue is actually coming from the senior executive who, moves out, he's in corporate enterprise world, and at the weekend, he hangs up the suit and he's putting on, the leathers, and he's getting out in the open road. That's actually where the greatest profit drives from, not from that core audience that you perceive it to be. You come back to Apple, $1 trillion brand. That started off its whole existence around the whole professional, creative target audience. And it's built its whole brand around the association with that really professional, creative sector user. But the reality of it is, it's actually not. It started off as a professional sector brand offering, but actually all its revenue driver comes from a consumer audience base. So, but if it didn't have the cachet of what it's associated with that professional audience, it would not translate so well from a consumer, because you are paying a premium when you buy any Apple product. Whether it's a laptop or a phone, you are paying a price premium, and it commands that premium because of the associations with the brand. And that's before we get into all the technical stuff. And then, you've got your lovers and haters of, I don't know how many times I've delivered working sessions, and or I might be delivering a keynote, and I might ask the question, so can I have a show of hands? Who's Android here? Who's an Android fan and who's an iPhone fan? And the room is typically equally divided. And this brings me on to another point. If you're building a strong brand, you can't be just vanilla in the middle. You've got to have something that is, again, a little bit triggering. So if you take, say, even Apple and Android, you will have people who absolutely can't stand Apple as a universal product and they don't like it at all. And then you'll have equally the absolute opposite, where somebody works in every product is integrated. It's so easy to use. They're not techie, but they're just diehard fans and they wouldn't entertain using anything else. So A brand to be compelling, if you're building a brand, gotta be able to be prepared to hang your flag on some issue or topic that's going to draw a little bit of strong emotional feeling in your target audience. If they're feeling a little bit benign and it's safe down the middle of the road, well, you're just going to blend in with everything else. So strong brands typically have an emotional driver that's relevant and compelling from a target audience perspective.
I'm thinking about a case that I actually just found out in the news. If you heard about that American company, Liquid Death, so they literally sell canned water. So instead of selling water in plastic bottles, they sell it in cans, metal cans, because you can recycle as many times as you want. It's actually better for the environment, right? They had the gigantic success in the US. Then they roll it out in the UK. Massive failure. No one's buying something called Liquid Death. Because why would you buy canned water, right? Might as well buy a clear bottle of water. What do you do when that happens as a company? Like when your message resonates in one market but completely fails in the other market?
That's really interesting. First of all, it comes back to, and I've worked in multiple different countries and jurisdictions and helped develop brands. That comes back to, and I'd be really interested in seeing that as a case study as to the details as to why it failed in the UK market versus the US. I'd be really interested to know. That's intriguing. And I can think of all sorts of reasons why I would prefer to potentially drink out of, if it's like a stainless steel can versus plastic. And it's not just environmental, it'll be all health as well. But it also comes back to how well did they actually research that sector and that market? Because you can't assume just because they speak the same language, but there's huge cultural differences between the UK and the US. And the US is like a continent. It's so big and each state has variables. And then if you're looking at the UK, well, yes, you've got, the England, Scotland, Wales. And then you've also got, even if you just take England, you've got the variations between North and South or Middle England. So understanding those regional differences culturally is huge. And then if you haven't done that, you don't understand, well, what are the cultural differences around how people make decisions? I mean, Ireland is an English-speaking world, but the difference between the UK and Ireland is quite significant culturally too. So you couldn't assume Ireland's actually quite an Americanized country. So they could have potentially dipped their toe into Europe and might have had a bit more success in the much smaller market of Ireland because it's more Americanized than the UK. Even though there's a huge proximity between Ireland and the UK. But again, it comes back to understanding what are the drivers around what really, and then if you understand the drivers, then you build your messaging around that. And it comes back to also your value proposition. How is that relevant or otherwise to your primary target audience?
So it's really a case of changing your value proposition, changing your message depending on the market you're going after, right? Because it cannot be one size fits all type of approach.
You can never be one size fits all, but the core purpose around what you're building and the values sitting behind that should actually fundamentally be the same. But it's a case of how you adapt the nuances to the relevant market. And then also it can be a case of, is that product even going to fly in that market? From a simple point of view, is what stage of development is that market at in terms of its receptiveness or readiness to actually want to purchase something like that? Because markets can be at different stages of development. Like I've worked in markets that you would describe as emerging economies. So their readiness to purchase something would be very different because their buying power is different. Or there would be, say, some parts of Europe that are much more digitized, much more tech savvy compared to others. So their readiness to engage and buy into something will be very different to other markets. Europe's a tapestry. Each country is very, very different. It comes back to the old-fashioned thing of doing your due diligence before you try and launch to market, because it can become a very expensive mistake. But you can also iterate. So the big upside if you're selling something that's tech-related is you can iterate and test cheaply in the marketplace before you fully invest. Whereas when you bring a physical product to market, it's much more capital-heavy launching into market. But again, test small, fail fast before you go out there and do a big, massive splurge. And that would be a fundamental principle you'd apply across any product development.
Can you, as a brand, can you fail publicly, own up to that, and actually carry on after that? I'm thinking, for example, that there's a brilliant example in history, which is the New Coke in the 80s. In the US, they launched There was the old Coke that everyone loved. And then because Pepsi was growing in market penetration, they said, "Ooh, let's launch a new Coke." And everyone hated the new Coke. And there were people going on sports games saying, I hate the new Coke, stuff like that. Yeah. Can you own up to that mistake, or do you just quietly withdraw from the market, whatever you put out there?
I think it depends on the kind of mistake. Well, I know it depends on the kind of mistake you make. So if you're making a mistake that's politically very sensitive or culturally very sensitive, then it becomes more difficult to come back from that. Or if you somehow insult your target audience base, it's very difficult to come back from that. But if you're making that kind of mistake, yes, I do think you can come back from it. It also comes back to, and this comes back to having your mitigation plans in place around your communications. Having thought through, if we mess up, how are we going to respond quickly, as opposed to finding yourself in the headlights under serious pressure and you can't think straight because you're going, holy, oh my goodness, we've just made an absolute shocker here. And of course, any of us under pressure, we don't think as clearly as we do when we have real time for reflection. So when you're building any brand, always give some thought for when the proverbial might happen, hits the fan, and you have got to have at least have something in place, even if you have to quickly iterate or adapt around that. So yes, you can recover, but a lot of that comes back to is how engaged, how active are you in the marketplace in terms of communication at a grassroots level with your target audience? And if you have a level of transparency and open communication at a leadership level, and you are open and forthcoming with your target audience, then you have a buffer of tolerance around when you make mistakes. But if you're trying to ignore it and pretend it hasn't happened, you're not going to do well, because particularly on platforms like X, which dominant platform, it's just going to be out there so fast before you know it in nanoseconds. It's very hard to come back from that, because you've got to own up on your mistakes.
I'm thinking about like a very well-known British brand, Land Rover, right?
Yeah.
Amazing cars. They've been in the market for decades, but you cannot get one of those cars and actually getting insured anytime, like anywhere in London, because they just refuse to do so, because they keep on getting stolen, because they've built something that actually doesn't work, which is a kill. Well, it works quite well, even for the criminals. Now, how do you own up to that mistake? And how do you say, you know what, we continue building really good cars, but there's a slight issue. We're kind of trying to fix it, so just bear with us. How do you ask consumers or customers to continue working with the brand until they fix an issue?
That's really challenging. I think you've got to have a level of transparency, and you've got to bring your audience with you on that journey. And you've got to say, listen, we're at this, we're trying to deal with a problem. You keep your audience, your target audience, up to date. Like, I've been on the receiving end of when tech falls over badly. And it is a critical element in terms of functionality within the business. And when you're not hearing stuff, whether it's via X or via email, you're not being kept updated, then your confidence dies very, very quickly. But if you're being kept in the loop, regular updates, we haven't got there, but we're there. We're expecting within the next few hours to have this, or in the next few months. Then you're going to maintain some level of confidence in the business, because you are showing up with a level of integrity. So you're holding on to that confidence. But if you're not communicating, doesn't matter what you're selling, you're going to, and once you don't have credibility and you lose confidence, and the market lose confidence in what you have to offer. So Land Rover is a brand with a huge legacy, and it has and I know a lot of Land Rover owners who drive and just absolutely love their cars. And there are other very prestigious car brands in the marketplace, but they are not the most reliable, statistically speaking, but they are still loved by their owners and who are prepared to pay a premium for them. It comes back to your open communications and kind of going, right, we have this problem, this is where we're at on fixing it, and we should be coming around to it and have our customers in a better place.
What about companies like, let's say, Ryanair? Because we were talking about open communication and being on Twitter all the time and stuff like that. Because let's be honest, Ryanair, we know they offer, a very cheap, no frills flight experience, and they keep on advertising that. Oh, the camera fell off. Speaking of Ryanair, things going badly. That was not the good thing is we can actually edit this bit out. Although it would be quite funny, just leave it on. Okay. Talking about bad companies and it collapses. Oh, hold on. Let me actually reposition this ever so slightly. So it's the same angle. And I think it's a bit too high, but that's okay. Now, I'm just thinking companies like Ryanair, right?
Yeah.
They own up to the fact that it's not the best flight experience, that people sit in seats that don't have a window seat. Actually, quite on the contrary, literally have the bulkhead in front of them. So is that a correct way of dealing with it? Just telling people that, that's what you should expect?
When I think about Ryanair and its trajectory, not only of growth, but as a brand from where it's come from, there's a reason why it's Europe's biggest airline. And it is the most successful airline by a lot of counts. But it comes back to that Marmite factor, or that love it or hate it factor. Marmite being a really British product that there's no middle ground on. Not everybody knows about it, but if you haven't heard about Marmite, look it up. And it's, again, a love it or hate. And they've actually developed the whole brand around that love it or hate it relationship. So for those of you who don't know, go have a look. It's a great reference point if you're building a brand. But coming back to Ryanair. So Ryanair is a very successful no-frills operation, and it effectively in Europe established that no-frill flight model very successfully. And I know people who will not step on board, and others who are huge fans, or others are just kind of go, yeah, I know what it is, but it gets me there. And I don't have to spend an arm and leg to get there. And I don't need to have the courtesy breakfast just to get me there. So Ryanair has a very successful model. And it has behind that, and I would also be an advocate for that, strong brands typically have a strong voice behind it. So Michael O'Leary is a very strong persona behind that brand, and unapologetically so. And that's the decision. And the one time I recall that Ryanair tried to dabble in the warm and cuddly space, it didn't really work because none of us believed it when they tried to be warmer and cuddly. And they did go through that because at one stage they were getting such negative feedback from their customer base that people were prepared to spend another 50 to 70 euros just to not have that. So there was a deal breaker factor that they pulled back on because it was actually hurting their bottom line. But when they tried to get very warm and cuddly about things, it just didn't work because it just was so far removed from where the brand has come from. So it's a great case in point of being really clear about what you have to offer, unapologetic about it, making sure you bring value in the context of what that value means, because value doesn't necessarily mean with all the bells and whistles. Value can mean getting us there on time, reliably so, and knowing that when I go on board, it's not coming with all the other add-ons. And you can still bring other elements into it. I mean, I've flown with, like all of us, with other discount airlines, and they bring other elements into their brand that makes it successful, and they still do it on a cost-effective basis. Yes, you can be, but you have to stay true. So you were saying, well, can you change your value proposition significantly? No. When you've really got an established business model that works, and that's what you're continuing to drive growth on, then you have to stay true to that and the purpose and the values and the vision behind that. But you can adapt subtle nuances that are relevant to that target audience and that jurisdiction. And Ryanair hasn't, when it's looked to expand its bases in different parts of Europe, it hasn't worked everywhere. Because some areas just culturally it just doesn't resonate enough. So they can fly in and out, but it's never going to become a hub because culturally it just jars too much with the values of that particular region.
And I'm thinking about, a very well-known case in history, which is Henry Ford. He was once asked or once told the media that if he was to build what people wanted, they would want a carriage with more horses. Now, how do you as a company and as a brand, I guess, lead the way, but also inspire the consumer, the customer to say, actually, this is what you actually need and what should actually be driving or using, in this case, a car for Henry Ford. How do you do that? Because it's completely, some of the companies I talk to are building something, revolutionary. And how do they tell the audience, actually, you don't want a faster, horse-drawn carriage, you actually want a car because of A, B, and C. So how do you do that?
actually think you can even bring that forward to another huge visionary who had a similar philosophy and very successfully so, which would have been Steve Jobs. And he had a very interesting trajectory.
There goes the cable. Oh, yeah. The funny thing about, okay, I just figured out what it was. It's a cable. I'm literally going to leave this on because I just think it's hilarious. The first time this actually happened so many times. So I'm literally going to leave this on.
A case in point, he actually would have had, I can certainly remember footage where he said something very similar. And oftentimes when you're a visionary around whether you're selling physical product or service, often your audience cannot necessarily envision what that is going to look like. And I think if we go back, remember I was talking about, that's a brand that started off with its roots around a professional base. But if we go back to the first time iPhone was brought to market and we go back and think about that launch and how he brought that to market and the language around it and how it was revealed. If you had asked the customer the average customer, mainstream customer around what they could envision, they wouldn't have seen it. And so Apple has consistently, under Steve Jobs' leadership, was an extremely innovative brand and often brought product to market that people hadn't envisioned. And of course, their launches were so exciting because you're going to go, what's the next big thing? And then you have, people lining up, buying tickets to be sold to. And the queues outside Apple's stores for new launches, like days before they can buy it, are infamous. And that's all part of your brand in terms of how it's perceived. Yes, building something successful. Now you do have, and I have worked with tech businesses, whereby you have challenges whereby you're bringing something so new to market that you can be ahead of trend or before the market is really understanding what it is you are doing and why it's really of huge value. So that means you've got to do a huge amount of educating. So part of your responsibility as the brand owner, leader, visionary is going to go, well, in order for the market to understand, we've got to present it to them in non-tech way, in language that's relevant to them around how this is going to add massive value and change to their lives in a way that's really positive. That's where storytelling becomes incredibly important. And then coming back to understanding your target audience. How does it solve a problem? How does it enhance their lives? How does it add value? How does it eliminate barriers whereby somebody might think, I'm not techie, I can't buy. This is too difficult to use. So it comes back to, how do you communicate what you have to offer in simple language that a 7 or 8-year-old can understand? And make it all about them.
And should you as a brand be accessible to getting feedback from customers, or should it be this highly unattainable brand that no one can actually reach out to? I'm thinking, for example, companies like Hermes. So Hermes makes a limited number of handmade handbags, and they're really hard to reach. It doesn't matter how much money you have. There's only a limited amount of handbags in the market, and that's it. That's the end of the story. How do you manage that as a brand? Or should you position yourself that way?
That's a very clear brand strategy around scarcity and deliberate intent, because in that context, it's very well understood by brand owners that, or you can just step back for a moment, when something is in limited amount of quantity or value and is unavailable, it immediately increases in its perceived value from a target audience point of view. So bring this back to something super simplistic. Say we have a problem with water supply, which we all would, to a certain level, if we're living in the western part of the world, we take for granted to some degree. So clean water supply, if that's a problem, then suddenly the supermarkets are going to sell out and water is priced at a premium. So if you take a lot of the premium brands, they deliberately operate on the basis of limited supply at a really premium high price point. And that is intentional and deliberate, because then you've got all the status symbol attached with, like, think of a handbag. There is actually a materials cost base to that. And yes, they are beautifully made with really high level of handmade skills work. But you can debate, well, how many thousands does that actually cost to make versus the actual end retail price? And that all comes back to, well, if you are your target audience, a certain kind of person who likes to have that draped over their arm and they like all the status symbols attached to it, and they know that of that particular model, only 100 are going to be made. And I'm just going to be one of those people that has it. That's what you're selling. As much the status symbol as it is phenomenal craftsmanship.
Interesting. I'm thinking about all the startups I know and, everyone building brands. And it's funny how some of that get the brand positioning really, really well. Yeah. And they know exactly what they're about. But others are still just playing around in the market. And they think, oh, everyone's going to buy our software. No, they're not. Everyone's going to use this. No, it doesn't work like that.
No.
So actually, asking these questions and understanding that better, I think will add a lot of value to our audience, because then they realize actually we should focus on a specific area of the market. Yeah. We should focus on our brand image and brand positioning. And then build around that, because that's ultimately what's going to get you more and more customers.
Like if you're starting with lean resources, get clear on where your initial target audience is going to be and why you're going to be entering that market. You can't conquer the world at one go, even if you are selling a tech product and it's sold for, it's so anybody in theory can access it. But you're not going to have success in every jurisdiction. So look at being successful in one and then scaling out from there, as opposed to trying to conquer it all at one go. So you're managing your resources and you're able to fund that growth.
It's an interesting balance, especially when you're asking for investors' money.
Yeah.
And you don't want to do any mistakes. Oh, no, we're going to do everything perfectly from day one.
Well, there's no such thing as perfect. There's going to be, it doesn't matter what you do in life. There's nothing perfect. And you have to get comfortable with imperfection. And I'm a recovering perfectionist. But you've got to get comfortable with imperfection. But the thing is, you just want to try and mitigate how bad those mistakes are so they don't completely wipe you out. So it's like iterate and manage exposure so you don't completely destroy the bottom line.
If people want to reach out to you and find more about all the wonderful things you do, how can they do so?
They can, if they want to get in touch with me, they can email me, brand@personadesign.ie, or they can get me through the website. So that's personadesign.ie.
Lorraine, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's my pleasure. You're very, very welcome. Great to chat.
Thank you. The podcast is also sponsored by Notion.so. Notion is offering 6 months for free for new users. Make sure you check out our website, thestartupevents.co.uk, to redeem this offer. This podcast is also sponsored by startupnetworks.co.uk. Startup Networks, it's an online forum where you can find all the resources you need to run your startup, from grants to investors to tips and tricks on how to be successful in your startup. This podcast is also sponsored by ODEV Tech. ODEV Tech is your premier software development partner. Make sure you check them out at odev.tech.